The cold came before anything else. It pressed through the thin wool of Daisy's cloak like fingers searching for bone, and she stood at the edge of the great courtyard of Stonehaven Keep, wondering if any place in this kingdom ever saw the sun. The stones beneath her boots were dark with frost, and the torches mounted along the walls burned low in the wind, throwing orange light that flickered but gave no warmth. She had been standing there long enough for her breath to cloud and dissolve a dozen times over. No one had come to receive her. She was 23 years old, the third daughter of a minor lord whose territory sat at the outermost border of the northern reach, and she had arrived in a borrowed carriage with a single chest of belongings and a letter sealed with red wax that declared her, in the formal language of the realm, to be the chosen bride of Evander Ashcroft, Alpha King of the Northern Wolves. She had not chosen this, but here she was. The carriage driver had deposited her chest in the courtyard without ceremony, and turned his horses back toward the road before the wheels had stopped rolling. Even he had not wanted to linger near these walls. Daisy understood the feeling. Stonehaven Keep rose around her like a crown of dark teeth, its towers disappearing into the low gray clouds above, its walls carved from the same black granite as the mountains behind it. Ivy grew along the lower stones, brown and dead in the late autumn chill. Everything about this place spoke of age and severity, of a power that had no interest in softening itself for anyone's comfort. She pulled her cloak tighter across her chest. Her braid, blonde as winter wheat, had come loose during the long journey, and strands of it pressed against her cold cheeks. She thought about what her mother had told her the morning she left home. "Keep your eyes down, Daisy. Don't speak unless spoken to. Give him no reason to find fault." Her mother had said nothing about what to do if no one came. The great iron doors of the keep remained closed. Daisy picked up the leather handle of her chest, dragged it several feet, then stopped. The weight of it was considerable, and the courtyard was enormous. She looked left, then right. A single guard stood near the far gate, watching her with an expression of profound indifference. She considered asking him for help, then noticed the rigid set of his jaw and thought better of it. She was dragging the chest again when the doors opened, not with the dramatic thunder she might have expected. They simply swung inward, slow and heavy, and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 40, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely from a face that had been handsome once, and now was sharp. She wore the dark blue of the household staff, a brooch of hammered silver at her collar, and she carried herself like someone who had been managing difficult situations for a very long time. "You are the Lord's daughter from the eastern borderlands," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am Daisy of Ashfield," Daisy replied, releasing the handle of her chest and straightening. "Yes." The woman studied her for a moment with eyes the color of slate. Something moved behind those eyes, not cruelty exactly, but assessment. The kind of gaze that measured and found usually that most things came up short. "I am Helene," the woman said. "Head of the household. You will follow me." She glanced at the chest. "Leave that. Someone will bring it." Daisy followed her inside. The interior of Stonehaven Keep was warmer than the courtyard, which was not saying a great deal. The entrance hall stretched upward to vaulted ceilings hung with iron chandeliers burning with dozens of candles. The floor was laid in dark stone, and tapestries covered the walls. Great hunting scenes in deep reds and greens. Wolves running through forests, figures on horseback silhouetted against impossible moons. The smell of burning pine and old stone filled the air, and beneath that, something else. Something wild and cool that Daisy could not name but felt, instinctively, like a warning. "The king does not receive guests today," Helene said, without turning as she led Daisy down a long corridor. "He is engaged in matters of the pack. You will be shown to your chambers, given time to settle, and presented at the evening meal. You will not wander the keep unaccompanied. You will not enter the east wing under any circumstances. You will not address the king unless he addresses you first. Daisy kept her eyes on the back of Helene's head and counted the rules as they came. Is there anything else? Daisy asked quietly. Helene stopped walking. She turned, and for a moment, her expression shifted into something that might have been curiosity, or might have been warning. Do not make the mistake, Helene said carefully, of believing that kindness and weakness are the same thing in this keep. The last person who made that mistake found the road south very quickly. She turned and kept walking. Daisy filed that away and said nothing. Her chamber was at the end of a corridor on the second floor, and it was large enough to echo. A bed with dark curtains, a fireplace where a small fire had been laid, a window of thick warped glass that looked out over the mountains to the north, already dusted with the first snow of the season. A plain wooden table, 2 chairs, a chest she didn't yet own filled with linens. The walls were bare stone. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, for just a moment, feel the weight of everything she had left behind. Her sisters, her mother's garden, brown and sleeping this time of year but still hers. The small room she had shared with her youngest sister, where they had whispered long after the candles were snuffed. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the fire. She was the Alpha King's chosen bride. The letter had arrived 6 weeks ago and had offered no explanation for why her name had been chosen, only that the arrangement had been made and that her presence was required before the first snowfall of the season. Her father had read it twice, looked at her over the top of the parchment with an expression she could not entirely decipher, and then placed it flat on the table. You will go, he had said. This is not a request one refuses. No. She supposed it was not. She was still sitting with her hands folded when a knock came at the door. A young servant girl entered, perhaps 16, carrying a tray with bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a cup of warm broth that smelled of herbs and black pepper. The girl set it on the table without meeting Daisy's eyes. Thank you, Daisy said. The girl paused, looked up. She had freckles across her nose and wide brown eyes that held something between surprise and caution. You're welcome, my lady, the girl said softly, as though the words were unfamiliar in her mouth. She left quickly. Daisy moved to the table and wrapped both hands around the cup of broth. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, the first flakes catching the last gray light before the afternoon dissolved entirely into evening. She thought about the evening meal, about presenting herself to a king she had never met, in a hall full of wolves who had not chosen her either. She thought about what Helene had said. Do not make the mistake of believing that kindness and weakness are the same thing. Daisy sipped her broth and watched the snow. Then, very quietly, she made herself a promise. Not her mother's kind of promise, eyes down, no reason to find fault. A different kind. The kind that started somewhere low in the chest and did not move. Whatever this place is, I will learn it, and I will not be erased by it. She had no way of knowing that 3 floors above her, in a stone-walled chamber where maps covered every surface and a fire burned high behind a carved iron grate, a man stood at a window watching the same snowfall, and had been told, only moments ago, that his bride had arrived. Evander Ashcroft, Alpha King of the Northern Wolves, said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned away from the window. Tell Helene, he said, his voice low and even as the edge of a blade, to ensure she is presentable for the evening meal. His second-in-command, a broad-shouldered beta named Kale, watched him with an expression that was carefully neutral. And if she is not what was promised? Kale asked. Evander did not look at him. He moved back to the maps, pressed his knuckles against the edge of the table, and stared at the lines of territory drawn in dark ink across pale parchment. Then, she will be returned, he said simply. Kale said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly, and he filed that away in the same way Daisy, 3 floors below, had filed away Helene's warning. The snow kept falling. The great hall of Stonehaven Keep was built for intimidation. Daisy understood that the moment she stepped through the arched doorway and felt the full weight of the space press down on her. The ceiling rose high above, crossed by dark wooden beams from which iron chandeliers hung like crowns, each one burning with dozens of candles that threw gold light across the long tables below. The walls were dressed in banners of black and deep gray, the sigil of House Ashcroft, a wolf's head beneath a crescent moon, repeated in silver thread at intervals down the hall. The smell of roasted meat and wood smoke filled the air, and beneath it, that same wild, cool undercurrent she had noticed when she first entered the keep. Stronger here, more present. Because the hall was full of wolves. Not in their shifted forms. They sat at the long tables in leather and wool and furs like any gathering of warriors and nobles might. But there was something in the quality of their attention, in the way every head turned when she entered. That was nothing like the gatherings she had known at her father's small keep. These were people who noticed everything, who processed her in a single glance with eyes that were too steady, too precise. Helene walked beside her. She had arrived at Daisy's chamber an hour earlier with a gown, not Daisy's own, but something from the keep's stores, deep green wool with a belt of braided leather, and had looked at her existing traveling dress with an expression that made her thoughts plain without requiring words. Daisy had changed without complaint. The green gown was fine, far finer than anything she owned, and it fit well enough, though the sleeves were slightly long, and she had folded them back once at the wrist. Her blonde hair had been rebraided, clean and tight down her back. "Keep pace with me," Helene murmured without moving her lips. "Do not stop walking. Do not look at the men at the left table. Look forward. The king is at the high table." Daisy looked forward. He was already watching her. She had expected to find him in the act of looking away, or speaking to someone, or absorbed in his wine. Anything but the direct, level, entirely unguarded attention she walked into. Evander Ashcroft sat at the center of the high table on a carved chair that stopped just short of being a throne, and he was watching her cross the hall the way a man watches something he is still deciding the nature of. His dark hair fell in long braids over one shoulder, and he wore black leather and a fur mantle that sat across his broad shoulders like something that belonged there. His eyes, even at this distance, were a startling shade of pale blue, ice-colored, clear and cold, as the mountain streams that fed the rivers through the northern reach. He was not what she had expected. She did not know what she had expected. Older, perhaps. Heavier with cruelty. The stories that filtered south about the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves were not gentle ones, and she had spent 6 weeks assembling a shape for him out of rumor and fear. The shape had not looked like this. It had not looked like a man in his late 30s who sat with perfect stillness and watched her with pale eyes that gave nothing away. She reached the high table. Helene stopped. Daisy stopped beside her. "My king," Helene said, with a slight incline of her head. "Daisy of Ashfield, daughter of Lord Fenwick of the eastern borderlands." A beat of silence. "Sit," Evander said. His voice was low and even and carried without effort across the distance between them. It was the voice of someone who never needed to raise it. Daisy moved to the chair that had been placed to his left. Not the immediate seat beside him, she noticed, but one removed, with an empty chair between them. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and kept her expression calm. The meal began. She learned things about him in that first hour that no letter or rumor had conveyed. He ate without ceremony, cutting his meat cleanly, drinking from his cup with measured care. He spoke rarely, and only to the man on his right. The broad-shouldered beta she would later learn was named Kale, dark-skinned, watchful, with a jaw like hewn timber, and the kind of stillness that came from being very good at violence and very comfortable with that fact. When Evander did speak, Kale listened with his full attention, responded briefly, and the exchange closed. No laughter, no ease, but no cruelty in it either. just economy. A man using exactly as many words as the situation required and not one more. He did not speak to her. She had been warned he might not. She had prepared for it. She still found the shape of it uncomfortable. The empty chair between them. The silence. The awareness that everyone in this hall was watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and calculation, and that the man who had summoned her here had, so far, treated her as a problem he had not yet decided how to categorize. She ate her bread. She drank her wine carefully, aware that her head was not accustomed to it. She kept her posture straight and her face composed, and she listened. And in listening, she learned other things. There was tension in this hall. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a pressure, a subtle wrongness in the air. It was not aimed at her, or not entirely. It sat between certain men at the long tables, in the angles of their bodies, in the conversations that paused when eyes moved in particular directions. A man 3 seats down from Cale, gray-bearded, heavy-set, wearing more silver at his collar than the others, watched the high table with an attention that was not admiration. Daisy noticed it the way she had always noticed such things. She had grown up in a small keep, with a complicated family, and had learned early that the most important conversations were never the ones being spoken aloud. The gray-bearded man's name, she would later learn, was Lord Edric Vane. She did not know that yet. She only knew the shape of what he was watching. Near the end of the meal, Evander turned to her. It happened without preamble. One moment he was looking toward the far end of the hall. The next his pale eyes were on her, and the quality of it, the directness, the weight, made her spine straighten involuntarily. "You arrived this afternoon," he said. "Yes, my king." The journey from the eastern borderlands takes 4 days in good weather. 5 this time of year. The mountain passes were slow. A pause. He looked at her with the same measuring expression she had seen when she crossed the hall, and she held it without looking away. Because looking away felt like the wrong choice, and her instincts were the only map she had in this place. "You are younger than the letter indicated," he said. "I am 23, she replied. The letter was accurate. Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not quite a reaction. More like the place where a reaction had briefly considered appearing and then changed its mind. "Are you afraid?" he asked. The question landed between them like a stone into still water, and she felt the ripples move outward. Felt Cale go slightly more still on Evander's right. Felt Helene, seated further down the table, lift her eyes from her plate. Daisy considered the question honestly. "I am uncertain," she said. "That is not the same thing." This time something did move across his face. Brief, controlled, but real. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than they needed to. "No," he said quietly. "It is not." He turned away. The meal continued. Later, walking back through the corridor toward her chamber with a candle Helene had pressed into her hand, Daisy replayed that exchange the way you turn a stone over to see what lies beneath it. "Are you afraid?" Not the question of a man who wanted her afraid. Something else. Something she could not yet name. She rounded a corner and nearly walked into a wall of a person. She stepped back. A man stood in the corridor. Not a servant, not a guard. He was broad and gray-bearded, and she recognized the silver at his collar before she recognized his face. He looked down at her with an expression that was arranged into something resembling welcome, but did not feel like it. "Lady Daisy," he said, with a slight incline of his head. "Lord Edric Vane. I had hoped to introduce myself. I am one of the king's council lords." "Lord Vane," she said carefully. "You must find Stonehaven very different from your father's keep," he said, his voice pleasantly conversational. "Every keep has its own character," she replied. He smiled. It did not touch his eyes. Quite so. I only wanted to say, and please take this as the kindness it is intended, that this arrangement has surprised many of us. The king has specific expectations. It would be wise for you to learn them quickly. He paused. Some brides have not. The last words fell between them like a blade laid flat on a table. Present, but not drawn. Not yet. Thank you for the counsel, Daisy said. She moved past him and kept walking, her candle steady in her hand, her heart beating faster than she let her face show. Behind her, she heard him make no sound at all. And that was almost worse. 3 days passed before Daisy understood the shape of her new life well enough to begin moving through it with any confidence. She learned the keep the way she had always learned difficult things, quietly, through observation, through the accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. She memorized which corridors were busy at what hours. She learned that the kitchens were warmest in the morning, that the guards changed at dawn and again at dusk, that the great library on the 3rd floor was almost always empty after the midday meal, and smelled of old parchment and cedar, and the particular stillness of a room full of knowledge that no one was currently using. She went there often. The servant girl who had brought her broth on the first evening was named Petra. Daisy learned this on the 2nd day, when she encountered her in the corridor outside her chamber, and asked directly. Petra had looked startled, then quietly pleased, and had answered with the careful manner of someone not accustomed to being asked anything by the people she served. She was 17, she told Daisy. She had come to the keep from a village 3 days' ride south, sent by her family when the pack required additional household staff. Do you like it here? Daisy asked her. Petra considered this with an honesty that Daisy appreciated. It is steady work, she said finally, and Lord Evander is fair. Fairer than some. Fairer than some. Daisy turned that phrase over in her mind through the rest of the day. On the 3rd morning, she encountered Kale. She had found her way to the inner courtyard, a smaller space than the great entrance yard, enclosed on 3 sides by the keep's walls, and open to the north where the mountains rose in pale gray tiers against a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. There was a training ground here, packed earth, wooden posts, iron-mounted rings for practice, and it was in use when she arrived. She had intended only to pass through on her way to the stables, where she had been told she might be permitted to walk. But she stopped at the edge of the courtyard, because what she saw made her stop. Evander was training. He moved through the courtyard with a large sword, in a manner that was nothing like the formal combat demonstration she had occasionally witnessed at her father's keep. There was no performance in it. He worked in silence, alone, running through sequences of movement that were so deeply habitual they had become something closer to thought, fluid and precise, and entirely without wasted motion. He wore no fur mantle here, only leather and linen, and his dark braids were pulled back from his face. In the cold morning air, his breath clouded and dissolved with each movement. Daisy stood very still at the edge of the courtyard. She did not know how long she watched. Long enough for the cold to settle into her fingers. Long enough to understand, in a way that no letter or rumor had conveyed, exactly what kind of creature this man was. Not cruel. She had been watching carefully enough these 3 days to revise that expectation. But immense. The word that kept returning to her was immense, and she did not mean only his physical size, though that was considerable. She meant the weight of him, the way he occupied space, even in solitude, as though the world organized itself slightly around wherever he happened to be standing. He has trained every morning since he was 9 years old. Daisy turned. Kale stood several feet behind her, arms folded across his broad chest, watching the courtyard with an expression of familiar tolerance. I did not hear you, she said. No, Kale agreed. He did not seem troubled by this. He looked at her sideways, measuring her with the same careful attention she had noticed in him at the evening meal. You are up early." "I am always up early," she replied. He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Evander complete another sequence in the packed earth below. "He will not harm you," Cale said quietly, "in case that is a thing you have been wondering." Daisy looked at him. He was still watching the courtyard, his expression giving nothing away. But there was something deliberate in the words, something that had been chosen carefully. "I have been wondering many things," she said. "That is among them." Cale nodded slowly. The king does not want what people say he wants. He is not looking for someone to command. A pause. He is looking for someone who will not break. Daisy considered this. "And the ones before me?" The letters mentioned previous arrangements. Something crossed Cale's face, brief, carefully controlled. "2, he said. "Both arranged by the council, not by the king. Both women sent back to their families within a fortnight. One because she could not bear the cold of the northern reach. One because—" He stopped. "Because?" Daisy pressed. Cale looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark and very steady. "Because Lord Vane made it impossible for her to stay," he said. The name landed between them like a coal dropped on stone. Daisy held Cale's gaze and did not let her expression shift. "I see," she said. "Do you?" He studied her a moment longer. Then, with the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth that might in different circumstances have been a smile, he said, "Perhaps you do." He left the way he had come silently, and Daisy turned back to the courtyard. Evander had stopped moving. He stood with the sword lowered, and he was looking directly at her. She did not look away. Neither did he. Across the cold morning air of the courtyard, in the gray light that preceded the sun's full arrival, they looked at each other for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and carried more information than either of them had intended to exchange. Then he turned away and resumed his practice, and Daisy continued toward the stables, and she carried the weight of that moment with her for the rest of the day, without examining it too closely. On the 4th evening, Lord Vane moved his piece. It came in the form of a summons, not from Evander, but from the council, requesting her presence in the Great Hall's antechamber, for what the written message described as a formal welcoming consultation. A tradition, the note claimed, for all new arrivals of noble status. Petra delivered the message with an expression she worked hard to keep neutral, but her hands were slightly too tight on the folded parchment. Daisy noticed. "Is this customary?" Daisy asked her. Petra hesitated. "It has happened before," she said carefully, "with the other ladies, the ones who left." Petra said nothing, which was its own answer. Daisy went. The antechamber was a smaller room off the main hall, lit by a single large fireplace and several iron stands of candles. Lord Vane was there when she arrived, along with 2 other council lords she recognized from the evening meals, one thin and pale with careful eyes, one older and heavy-set, who had not yet looked directly at her in any gathering. They stood around a table with cups of wine and the performed ease of men who had prepared a scene and were waiting for their audience. "Lady Daisy," Vane said warmly. "Thank you for attending. Please, sit." She sat. She folded her hands on the table and looked at each of them in turn. The questions began pleasantly enough. Her family, her upbringing, her experience managing a noble household. She answered simply and honestly, because honesty was harder to use against a person than the gaps between carefully arranged half-truths. Then Vane set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. "There is a matter," he said, "that the council feels you should understand, as someone new to our keep." His tone was still pleasant. His eyes were not. "The Alpha King's bloodline requires a very particular kind of strength. His heir must carry the full power of the Northern Wolf line. The council has a responsibility, a duty, you understand, to ensure that any arrangement made is one that will serve the pack. He paused. We have conducted a full inquiry into your lineage. Daisy kept her hand still on the table. And, she said, your maternal grandmother, the Thin Lord said, almost gently, was fully human. No wolf blood, no pack lineage. He tilted his head. You carry less than a quarter of the required heritage. By the old laws of the Northern Reach, you are not a permissible match for the Alpha King's line. The room was very quiet. Daisy looked at Lord Vane. He looked back at her with the expression of a man delivering difficult news he had absolutely arranged to deliver. The king was made aware of your lineage before the letter was sent, she said. Was he? Vane smiled. We have reason to believe the letter was drafted without full council consultation. An oversight, of course. These things happen. But the duty of the council is to correct such oversights. He spread his hands. We are not your enemies, Lady Daisy. We simply must do what is best for the pack. I am certain you understand. Daisy stood. She was very calm. She could feel how calm she was, the way you feel the ground under your feet. Solid, reliable, hers. I understand a great deal, my lord, she said. Thank you for the consultation. She left before any of them could speak again. She walked the corridor back to her chamber, with measured steps, and a mind that was moving very fast beneath a surface she kept absolutely still. Vane was lying, or bending the truth into a shape that served him, about the king's awareness. She felt certain of it. What she did not yet know was why. What Lord Edric Vane wanted from the removal of the Alpha King's chosen bride, and what he intended to put in her place. She did not yet have enough pieces. She would need more. She turned the corner toward her chamber and nearly walked into Evander. He was alone, which surprised her. No guard, no Kale. He stood in the corridor outside her door as though he had been there for some time, and when he saw her his expression shifted, something quick and unguarded crossing his face before control returned. You attended the council's consultation, he said. I did, she said. I did not authorize that meeting. A beat of silence. I know, she said. He looked at her with those pale, clear eyes for a long moment. The torchlight in the corridor moved between them, throwing his face in and out of shadow. What did they say to you? He asked. And Daisy, who had been told by her mother to keep her eyes down and give no reason to find fault, who had been warned by Helene and tested by Vane and measured by everyone in this cold stone keep since the moment she arrived, looked at the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves and decided, in that moment, to tell him the absolute truth. She told him everything. Evander listened without interrupting. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood in the corridor with his back against the cold stone wall, arms folded, and he listened to every word she said with the complete focused attention of someone who understood that listening was not a passive act, but a deliberate one. His face gave almost nothing away, but his eyes moved, tracking her words, filing them, connecting them to things she could not see. When she finished, the corridor was very quiet. The lineage argument, he said finally. Vane used it with the second woman as well. Daisy absorbed this. Then it is a tool, not a law. The old laws exist, Evander said, but their interpretation belongs to the Alpha King, not the Council. Vane knows this. His jaw tightened slightly. He is counting on you not knowing it. He is counting on me leaving, Daisy said. Evander looked at her. Are you going to? She met his gaze steadily. No. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of something he had been quietly uncertain about. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding something, though she could not yet tell what. Come, he said. He turned and walked down the corridor, and after a single breath of hesitation, Daisy followed. He led her up 2 flights of stairs and through a doorway she had not been through before, into a chamber that was clearly his own study. Maps on every surface, as she had somehow known there would be. A fire burning high in the iron grate. The smell of leather and pine resin and old ink. Shelves of rolled parchments along one wall. A large table in the center covered in weighted documents. A pair of iron candlestands burning steadily on either side. It was a working room, not a ceremonial one. Everything in it was used. Evander moved to the fire and stood with his back to it, facing her. "Lord Vane has been on this council for 19 years, he said. "He served under my father before me. He is very good at appearing to act in the pack's interest while acting entirely in his own." He paused. "He wants to place his niece in the position you currently occupy. She is 20, fully wolf-blooded, and entirely under his control. With a queen he controls, and a king he has been methodically isolating from outside alliances for the past 3 years, he would hold the true power of the Northern Reach without holding the title." The fire crackled between them. Daisy felt the warmth of it reaching her, the first time in days she had felt genuinely warm. "The isolation," she said slowly. "That is why the previous brides were removed." "Partially." Evander's expression was controlled, but beneath the control she could hear something. Not quite anger, but its older, quieter cousin. The kind of feeling that had been sitting with a person long enough to become simply the shape of things. Each time an outside connection was established, Vane found a way to sever it. Lords who sought alliance were met with delays and complications until they stopped seeking. Correspondence that left the keep seemed occasionally not to arrive. He looked at her directly. "I have been aware of this for some time. What I have lacked is proof that extends beyond what I myself have observed. A king who moves against his counsel without evidence becomes a tyrant in the telling of it. The story matters." Daisy thought of Lord Vane's face in the antechamber. The performed warmth. The arranged delivery of the lineage argument, so clearly rehearsed. "He will have done this carefully," she said. "Yes. And he will move again soon. If I do not leave on my own, he will arrange for something more." She chose the word carefully. Decisive. "Yes," Evander said again. His pale eyes were on her steadily. "Which is why I am telling you this. You have a right to know the nature of the ground you are standing on." Daisy looked at him across the firelit room and understood, perhaps for the first time since the carriage had deposited her in the frozen courtyard, something true about this man. He was not telling her this to enlist her as a weapon. He was telling her because he believed she deserved to make an informed choice. The distinction mattered enormously. "What do you need?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Vane is careful with his words in my presence. He always has been. But he is not careful with people he considers inconsequential." He paused. "He spoke to you tonight with very little guard." "He thought I would leave by morning," Daisy said. "He had no reason to be careful." "No." Evander's expression shifted, brief, controlled, but she was beginning to learn the register of him. "He underestimated you." She did not let herself react to that. "You need him to keep doing that." "I need him to show me what he is actually building," Evander said. "Not the face he shows the council chamber, the structure beneath it, the alliances, the promises he has made to other lords, the mechanism he intends to use." He looked at her directly. "I cannot get that from inside my own court. I am watched too carefully. But someone he has dismissed as a temporary inconvenience would not be watched at all," Daisy finished. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the window of the study, snow was falling again, fine and constant, dusting the dark stone of the keep's outer walls white. "This is dangerous," Evander said. "I will not pretend otherwise." "I know," she said. You do not have to. I know that too, she said quietly. I am still saying yes. He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight was warm between them, and the study was very still, and she was aware of the weight of what had just passed between them. Not an order, not a command, but something chosen. Something that changed the nature of what she was doing here from endurance into purpose. Then we will need to be careful, he said. What followed was a week of careful performance. Daisy played the role Lord Vane expected. A young woman of minor noble birth, slightly overwhelmed by the scale of her new circumstances, finding her footing slowly and with visible effort. She attended the evening meals. She spoke little. She allowed Petra to guide her through the keep's routines without asking too many questions in the wrong company. She visited the library, the kitchens, the inner courtyard, and she listened, always, to the conversations that occurred in the spaces around her, in the way that only people who have been underestimated their entire lives know how to listen. Vane's inner circle, she discovered, was smaller than it appeared. 3 council lords moved in his orbit with genuine loyalty. 2 others who sat at his table were men of convenience. They would align with whoever held the most certain power, and their alignment had not yet fully committed. One of them, a middle-aged lord named Aldrich with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, had the particular quality of a man who had made a choice he was no longer comfortable with. She sat beside him in the library one afternoon, when both of them had arrived independently, and neither had left. They spoke, at first, about the books. He was a man who loved history, she discovered, and she knew enough history to speak of it honestly. He thawed slowly, the way cold stone thaws, not all at once, but degree by degree. You are not what Vane expected, Aldrich said eventually, over the open pages of an old map collection, his voice very low. No, she agreed simply. He looked at her with those tired eyes. He expected you to be afraid. I am uncertain, she said. That is not the same thing. He was quiet. Something moved across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or the particular expression of a man who has waited longer than he should have for someone to say a true thing. He has a meeting, Aldrich said very quietly, looking back at the map collection. 3 nights from now, in the old watchtower on the keep's north wall, lords from 2 border territories. He paused. Their names are in the council record under a routing dispute, but the routing dispute was resolved 4 months ago. Daisy did not move. She turned a page of the map collection. Thank you, she said softly. Aldrich said nothing more, but when he left the library, his shoulders were slightly less bowed than when he had arrived. She told Evander that evening. He listened with the same complete attention he always gave her, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned meant he was assembling pieces, not struggling for words. The North Watchtower, he said. It is outside the range of the usual guard rotation. Yes, she said, deliberately, I think. He looked at her. They were in the study again. It had become the place where the real conversations happened. Late in the evening, when the keep had settled into its nighttime quiet, the fire burning low and the snow pressing softly against the dark windows. She had noticed, without making anything of it, that he had begun to look at her differently than he had in those first days. Not with less guard, with less distance. As though whatever category he had been placing her in had proven insufficient, and he had abandoned it in favor of simply seeing her directly. Cale and I can be there, he said, unseen. If Vane discovers you, he will claim it was private business. Without a witness who heard the substance of the meeting, I have nothing. He paused. I need someone inside the room. Daisy understood before he finished the thought. The watchtower has a servant's access passage, she said. Petra showed me the keep's older sections last week. She thought I was simply curious about the architecture. Evander looked at her with those pale eyes, and in the quiet of the study, with the fire throwing its warm light between them, she saw something cross his face that was entirely unguarded, a kind of quiet astonishment, and beneath it, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with council schemes or strategic advantage. "Daisy," he said, her name simply, as though he was learning the sound of it. She felt the warmth of the fire on her face and kept her expression steady. "3 nights from now," she said, "I will be in that passage." The night of the 3rd day arrived cold and moonless. Daisy had spent the hours before carefully. She ate at the evening meal as she always did, sitting at the high table with composed silence, allowing Vane to see her exactly as he expected, a minor lord's daughter enduring the motions of a position she had not yet understood was already slipping from her. She even allowed herself one moment of visible fatigue, pressing 2 fingers briefly to her temple in a gesture she knew he would see in catalogue. Something to tell him that she was wearing thin. Something to keep him comfortable. Comfort made people careless. She returned to her chamber at the usual hour. She let Petra help her out of the green gown and into a plain linen sleeping dress, thanked her, and waited in the darkness after the door closed for the sounds of the corridor to settle into the deep quiet that came after midnight. Then she rose, dressed in her darkest traveling clothes, a plain wool tunic, dark leggings, her worn leather boots that made no sound on stone, and pulled her gray cloak around her shoulders. The servants' passage Petra had shown her ran through the old section of the keep's north wall, behind the main corridors, accessible through a door concealed by a heavy tapestry of a winter hunt near the kitchens. The passage was narrow and cold, and smelled of old mortar and the particular darkness of spaces that received no fire and little air. She moved through it by touch and memory, one hand trailing the rough stone wall, counting the paces she had memorized when she walked it in daylight 2 days ago, under the guise of following Petra's tour of the keep's older architecture. 40 paces north, a turn. 20 paces. The passage widened slightly near the base of the watchtower, and then she heard the voices. She stopped moving. The passage had a thin gap in the mortar at one section of wall. Not a window, not even an intentional opening. Simply the result of old stone settling over many decades. And the voices came through it with startling clarity in the cold, still air. Vane's voice she recognized immediately. The careful warmth of it, the arranged pleasantness that she now understood, was a performance sustained so long, it had become simply his voice. "The arrangement is simple," Vane was saying. "When the girl is gone, and she will be gone by the end of the fortnight, I am confident of that. The king will require a new bride within the season. The council will present my niece formally, with full endorsement. The wedding will occur before the spring thaw." Another voice, older, rougher, the accent of the far western border territories. "And the matter of the eastern passes. Our arrangement stands?" "The eastern passes will be administered under the new agreement," Vane said smoothly. "Lord Harwick's territory, Lord Brennan's territory, both will benefit considerably from the revised trade routes once the new council structure is in place." A pause. A third voice, younger, carefully neutral. "And the king?" Silence. A different quality of silence than the pause before. "The king," Vane said, "has been making decisions increasingly at odds with the Pact's stability. There are those on the council who would support a formal petition of diminished authority. Not removal. The Pact would not accept removal. But a restructuring. A council of regency, temporary in nature, to manage affairs during a period of strategic transition. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man describing something he had been building for a very long time. The king would remain in name. The authority would sit elsewhere. Daisy pressed herself against the cold stone of the passage and breathed very carefully. This was not simply about a bride. It had never been about a bride. The brides had been a mechanism. Each removal a step in a longer campaign to reduce Evander to a figure without real power, isolated from outside alliances, surrounded by a council that answered to Vane. The niece would be the final piece. A queen who carried Vane's interests into the innermost circle of the northern wolf throne. She had heard enough. She needed to move. She turned in the passage and began making her way back, her hand on the wall, counting paces. At the turn, she misjudged the distance in the dark, and her boot heel scraped stone. A small sound, nothing significant in an empty keep. The voices in the watchtower stopped. Her heart accelerated. She did not run. Running made noise. She moved faster, counting paces, 14, 15, 20. The exit tapestry was here. She pressed her palm flat against the stone, searching for the door's edge. The passage door opened from the other side. Cale stood in the opening, torch in hand, his expression absolutely unreadable. Behind him, further down the kitchen corridor, Evander. Daisy exhaled. "They heard something," she said quietly. "We need to move." Cale was already pulling the tapestry back into place. Evander crossed to her in 3 strides, and she looked up at him and said, keeping her voice low and even, "I heard everything. The border lords are Harwick and Brennan. The plan is a council of regency, not simple removal. Vane wants the authority, not the title. He has been building this for years." Evander's face in the torchlight was very still, but his eyes were not still. They were the eyes of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had just been handed the last piece of something. "Names," Cale said quietly. "We have the names and the structure." "And Lord Aldrich," Daisy said. "He gave me the meeting location. He will speak, I believe, if asked correctly. He is a man who made a choice he regrets." Evander looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Come." And the 3 of them moved through the corridor away from the watchtower, away from Vane's voices, into the deeper interior of the keep. The reckoning came 2 days later. Evander called a full council session in the Great Hall. All lords, all ranking pack members, the household senior staff. He sent the summons before dawn, and Daisy, who had been awake to see the messengers dispatched, watched from her window as the torches began moving through the keep's courtyard below. She dressed carefully, the green wool gown, her hair braided, her hands steady. She attended the session standing at the side of the great hall, not at the high table, because this was not her moment to command but to witness. She stood beside Petra, who had come without being asked, and whose presence was its own small form of courage. Evander did not raise his voice once. That was what she would remember most afterward. He laid out what had been uncovered with the same economy he gave to everything. The meeting in the watchtower, the names, the nature of the arrangement, the pattern of interference stretching back 3 years. He had a document from Aldrich, signed that morning, attesting to the Council of Regency proposal. He had correspondence recovered from Vane's chambers by Cale in the early hours. Letters to Harwick and Brennan that had been carefully preserved, because Vane was the kind of man who kept his leverage in writing. He laid all of it before the assembled hall, with perfect calm, and let it speak. Lord Vane, for the first time in 19 years in this court, had nothing arranged to say. The thin lord beside him went pale, and immediately began speaking, of being misled, of misunderstanding, of loyalty to the king above all else. The heavy-set lord said nothing and looked at the floor. Harwick and Brennan were not present. They would be summoned separately, their border agreement suspended pending review. Vane himself, when he finally spoke, tried the careful warmth one last time. He spoke of the pack's interest, of difficult decisions, of a king who had, and here his voice acquired a note of something that wanted to be righteous, perhaps not fully understood the pressures his council bore on his behalf. Evander let him finish. Then he said, "You are removed from this council. Your lands in the northern reach remain yours, and you will live out your years on them without interference. You will have no further seat in this hall, no authority over pack affairs, and no contact with border lords or trading agreements. This is the judgment." A pause. "It is generous. You are aware of that." Vane looked at him across the great hall, with the expression of a man who had gambled everything on a certainty and watched it dissolve. "Leave," Evander said. Vane left. The hall exhaled. That evening, for the first time, Evander came to the library. Daisy was there when he arrived, sitting at the table near the window with a map spread open before her, one of the old ones from the collection she had looked at with Aldrich. The snow outside had stopped. The sky, for the first time since she had arrived at Stonehaven Keep, was clear, and the moonlight lay in pale rectangles across the library floor. He sat across from her without ceremony. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire in the library's small grate was low and warm, and the room smelled of cedar and old parchment, and outside the window the stars were very bright and very cold. "Aldrich will remain on the council," Evander said. He came forward. "That matters." "It does," Daisy agreed. He looked at the map between them. She watched him look at it, at the lines of territory, the rivers and passes and borders, the long work of a kingdom that had to be held and managed and protected, day after day, without rest. "You are not what I expected," he said. She thought of Cale, saying almost the same thing in the courtyard. "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a moment. "Someone I would have to protect," he said finally. "Someone I would have to manage around. Someone who would be—" He paused. "A complication." And instead, he looked at her across the map. In the moonlight and the low firelight, his pale eyes were very clear, and there was nothing managed in his expression, nothing arranged, just him, looking at her, with the particular quality of a man who has spent a long time behind his own walls and is standing at the edge of something he did not expect to want. "Instead," he said quietly, "you change things." Daisy felt the warmth of the library around her, and the cold of the mountains outside the window, and the strange, certain weight of a life that had brought her here against all her choosing, and was beginning, improbably, to feel like something that was hers. She looked back at him. "So did you," she said. He reached across the map and covered her hand with his, a single deliberate gesture, unhurried and entirely without pretense. His hand was warm and very steady, and hers, beneath it, was too. They sat like that for a long while, in the quiet library, in the moonlight, with the mountains standing white and ancient outside the glass. Word count 11621. Continuando diretamente para o epílogo, capítulo final da história. Epilogue. Winter came fully to Stonehaven Keep 3 weeks later, and it came without apology. The snow arrived in sheets from the northern mountains, burying the courtyard to knee-height, sealing the roads that connected the keep to the wider kingdom beneath a silence so complete that even the wolves moved more quietly than usual, as though the season itself demanded a certain respect. The great hall burned with fires at both ends, and the smell of pine resin and roasting chestnuts filled the corridors, and Petra began appearing each morning at Daisy's door with an extra blanket she had not been asked to bring, and that she presented without comment, which Daisy accepted without comment, and which was its own small language between them. The wedding took place on the first clear day of deep winter. It was a modest ceremony by the standards of what a king's wedding might have been. No visiting lords from distant territories, no procession through the streets of a great city, no jeweled gown or golden crown. Daisy wore the green wool dress with a circlet of hammered silver that Helene placed on her head that morning, with hands that were steadier than the occasion required and eyes that were not entirely dry, which was the most feeling Daisy had ever seen the woman display, and which she treasured quietly. Evander stood at the front of the great hall in black leather and his dark braided hair, and watched her walk toward him with those clear, pale eyes. And what was in them was entirely unguarded. And Daisy, who had walked into this keep with nothing but uncertainty, and a wool cloak, and a promise she had made to herself in a cold room beside a small fire, walked toward him with her chin level and her hands steady, and something in her chest that felt, improbably and completely, like home. Cale stood at Evander's right. He kept his expression neutral throughout the ceremony and succeeded, except for the moment when Daisy spoke her vow, at which point something moved across his face that he made no effort to conceal, because some things are too honest to conceal. The vows were simple. Old words used in the Northern Reach for generations, worn smooth with use into something that had the quality of truth. I will stand at your side. I will speak true in your counsels. I will not be broken by what is hard, and I will not be softened into silence by what is easy. I am yours, and you are mine, not by command, but by choosing. When it was finished, Evander took her hand and she felt the warmth of it, the same warmth as the night in the library, unhurried and steady and entirely without pretense. The hall of Stonehaven Keep was full of wolves who had watched a queen arrive as a stranger and become something else entirely, and the sound that filled the hall was not the performative celebration of a court event, but something more honest. The sound of a pack that had been quietly fractured, recognizing in the moment of this union the possibility of something whole. Lord Vane departed Stonehaven the following morning, taking 3 wagons, 2 servants, and a silence that he wore like a punishment. He returned to his lands in the western portion of the Northern Reach, and was not heard from again in the council chamber. Aldrich, who had signed his testimony with ink-stained fingers and the expression of a man setting down a long-carried weight, took on the role of council record-keeper, a quieter position than he had held before, but one he performed with a thoroughness that suggested he was trying to be useful in the specific way that mattered. Harwick and Brennan sent formal letters of apology to the Crown within the month. The border agreements were renegotiated. The eastern passes, which had been a point of contention for years, were settled under terms that left both territories satisfied without requiring anyone to lose face entirely, which is the only way such things are ever truly settled. Cale, who had been Evander's second for 11 years, remained his second. Some things do not need to change. In the deep of that winter, on a night when the snow pressed soft and constant against the library windows, and the fire had burned to comfortable coals, Daisy sat with her husband at the old map table and told him something she had been holding since the first week. "When I arrived," she said, "I made myself a promise. In my chamber, beside a very small fire, while the snow started outside." He looked at her. "What promise?" "That whatever this place was, I would learn it," she said, "and I would not be erased by it." Evander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did considerably more than that." "I know," she said simply. He looked at her with those pale eyes that she had learned to read, that she had learned contained more warmth than they showed, more feeling than his controlled expression ever fully released. He reached across the maps, the old familiar gesture, unhurried and steady, and covered her hand with his. "Stay," he said. A single word, not a command, a request, from a man who did not make them easily, to a woman who had learned the difference. She turned her hand beneath his and laced her fingers through his fingers. "I already am," she said. Outside, the snow fell on the mountains and the walls and the courtyard and the dark stone of Stonehaven Keep, covering everything in the same patient white, the same deep quiet, the same sense of a world resting before whatever came next. Inside, the fire held. The maps lay open on the table, the territories of the Northern Reach drawn in dark ink across pale parchment. And in the warm light of the library, the Alpha King and his queen remained at the table long after the candles burned low, talking of ordinary things, council matters, the spring planting in the outer villages, a leak in the east corridor roof that had been reported twice and repaired once, until the fire went to embers and the room grew softly dark around them. Daisy of Ashfield, who had arrived at Stonehaven Keep with uncertainty and a wool cloak and a quiet, unbreakable promise, did not leave. She was home, and the story of what she had built here quietly, stubbornly, entirely on her own terms, had only just begun to settle into the walls of this old keep, where it would remain long after the snow melted, long after the maps were redrawn, long after the torches in the great hall had been lit and extinguished 1,000 more times. It was simply finally hers. Finally,